A controversy got started on Twitter just recently with a thread, sometimes called the thread, about academic life by a professor, Danielle Dick, who is currently at Rutgers, which she joined in January 2022. Going there, getting full tenure, also being appointed as the inaugural director of the Rutgers Addiction Research Center, and leaving Virginia Commonwealth University. So here's what she said that caught a lot of people's attention. She began her thread by saying, "My feed is full of people leaving academia for industry. I'm not saying academia is perfect, but I love being a professor, and I think academia can be a wonderful career option, a thread on why." Then she followed that up, saying, "Compared to many other careers, as a faculty member, you get to be your own boss. As long as you're productive, no one is looking over your shoulder constantly. Often you check in with your supervisor for a review only once a year. You have tremendous freedom. Great work-life balance. You can take off as needed to be there for kids' schools, activities, and other things you want to do. As long as you're getting your stuff done, no one is scrutinizing what hours you work. It's fun. You choose what you're working on and get to pursue questions that are interesting to you. Smart colleagues. Academia is full of really interesting people who are passionate about a wide variety of topics. You have access to a wealth of expertise and all the interesting learning opportunities that come with seminars, classes, etc. It doesn't get boring. You can adapt what you're working on and change your focus over time. Teaching, training, grants, leadership opportunities, administration. You can change your job without changing your job, and that keeps things interesting and stimulating. I know that everyone's experience is unique, and I won't pretend there aren't real problems in academia. Discrimination, low pay in certain positions, pressure to bring in grants, challenging colleagues or supervisors. Everyone weighs the pros and cons differently. This is where you might hear like a record scratch if I was doing sound effects in here. And let's take a look at what some people said right off the bat. So, "This reads like satire." Then somebody else wrote, "The fact it's been up for 3 days with no indication of self-reflection on the part of the author is really something." Another, "Truly amazing someone can put out a 5-tweet thread about how great academia is without not even once engaging with what the actual problems are." Now, of course, you could say, well, she did mention that there are some problems, but it's an overly rosy picture, isn't it, that Professor Dick is sketching out. Mark writes here, "Dr. Dick is rightly getting dragged for this. There's nothing wrong with loving your job as an academic. I do. But a post that completely ignores the abundant injustice, abuse, and crushing hardship that so many face amounts to little more than let them eat cake." Now, if you're not an academic and you're going by portrayals of academia in the popular media that we've seen like on TV shows or talking heads on various, politics shows, you might actually be forgiven for not understanding what these people are talking about. Things are pretty difficult in academia, and they have been for the majority of academics, at least here in America, for decades. Here's another interesting response. "Please consider deleting this. It's the worst possible time to trumpet the wonderful option that most people trying to be academics will never have." And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, Danielle Dick did also, follow this up, and she finished her thread by saying, "I also think that having more academics in the private sector is a good thing, but I wanted to point out some of the wonderful parts of being in academia as well." And then, several days later, 4 days later to be precise, she said, "I want to add context since this thread has been circulated widely in a way I never expected." Let's stop there for a moment. This is a very, very tone-deaf thread by somebody who has really lucked out in many respects and comes across to most of the fellow academics on Twitter who had something to say about this as extraordinarily lucky, privileged, and almost willfully ignorant about what she might not even consider them, colleagues in academia face. So she goes on and she says, it was in response to comments specifically by colleagues in my field who were deciding between higher paid jobs in industry versus taking a tenure track job at a Research One university. Now, isn't that a delightful option to have? Higher paid jobs in industry or a tenure track job at a Research One university? If you do have that option, that's pretty awesome for you. Now, here's some follow-ups to it. You are what your watch says. I wasn't going to engage with this tweet because it's just what only a well-paid tenure-track academic would say. And then I became actually curious if you think most people were leaving academia by choice and not material necessity. An option implies reasonable choices, not tragic dilemmas. And so that, I think, is a very important point to make. Along with this, Jeanette Smith says, thought this was a joke tweet to begin with. I loved academia, and it was a great career option, but job security is denied to so many. Most people leaving are not doing so out of choice, but because they can't afford to stay with the insecurity. This is the present day reality and the reality from the past decades. It's not a completely new thing. For most academics, if you look at these statistics, most academics are not tenured, let alone even tenure track. Most are in precarious positions. Let's follow up about Rutgers itself. Suzanne Boswell says, there are wonderful things about being a professor, but most people teaching in academia aren't professors. They're adjuncts. Professor, how many adjuncts work at Rutgers? How many adjuncts were fired from Rutgers during the pandemic? Just out of curiosity. There was no response, of course. But she wrote, I will answer this question myself. Before the pandemic, 3,000 PTLs taught at Rutgers. These are part-timers. 25% of them were fired. They were not their own boss. They did not set their own working hours. Many of them were just as, if not more, qualified as any Rutgers faculty member. And this is a big problem within academia. Whether somebody has a tenure track job or not depends on very contingent matters. Those who get them often act as if they're better than everybody else, when really, if you look closely at the level of teaching or even research, many of the tenure track people are not particularly shining, you could say. Here's a bunch of other responses that all have a common theme. No one is disputing that things look pretty good from your lofty heights. The issue is that many of us on precarious contracts will never get there. And those of us with disabilities or caring responsibilities or no economic support have even less of a chance of securing tenure. Now think back to what Dick said about, you can just take off if you want to go to a child's event or something like that. That may be the reality for her. That's not the reality for many people working in academia. Somebody else writes, so this is basically, I don't understand why people have money problems. Why don't they just win the lottery like I did? And that's a valid response, I think. I'm not sure if this one is true or not, but it's worth considering. From Melanie Haupt. This is 100% a faculty who relies on staff, whom she addresses as folks, to do all the invisible labor of making a department run, and also doesn't know how to operate the copier. Now, whether Professor Dick is that person, I think that all of us in academia have met those people. And there's I wouldn't say 100% chance, but let's, rate it 80 to 90%. Here's a typical response by somebody who has worked as an adjunct. I had to work as an adjunct at two different schools on opposite sides of the Twin Cities metro area because neither had the funding for a full-time tenured professor. Between the two, I wasn't guaranteed work the following year, always afraid the department would be cut only had part-time adjunct benefits, not protected tenured benefits, no office space at one of the schools, had to meet students for office hours in the library. Part-time status meant I didn't know school procedures well enough to help students navigate issues. I think anybody who's taught as an adjunct can relate to some of this. Adjunct benefits, oh, that's nice if you've got them. Most places don't have adjunct benefits. You're paid poorly. You don't have any sort of job security. If a full-timer decides that they want your class, they'll steal it from you, sometimes just weeks before the semester begins. Here's another one from Disabled Doctor. Some of us don't leave academia for industry willingly, and academia can be incredibly inaccessible to many for a variety of reasons. So glad you are able to make it work, but to assume others need a description of your privileged situation is kind of an odd take. Continuing on, here's some other posts and responses that I think are pretty on point. Althea says, yes, we know academia can be like this, which is why many of us worked so hard to get a PhD. The fact is, only the lucky end up in those positions, so this genre of tweet feels incredibly condescending to anyone who has not been so lucky or who has faced real barriers. Melatonin says, posting about how wonderful it is to have a stable career in academia is like posting how great it is to be a wealthy German duchess. Like, yes, I'm sure that's great for you, my liege. And, the rate of tenure track positions opening up is declining over the years, and it's not quite so bad as this is making it out to be, but it's pretty close. And that's where this other one comes in. Food and service was great, and crew manning the lifeboat lovely. 4 out of 5 stars, only because luggage got slightly wet. Review by first-class passenger of the Titanic. Implying that academia is kind of going down, and in some respects it is. Here's a good point made about the provincialism of this tweet. This thread. Much of this thread is relevant to the USA and possibly only research universities there. Now I'm going to pause and say, and possibly only to those who are lucky enough to have the tenure track positions in research universities there and don't encounter any real problems in doing so. He goes on and says, in the UK, for example, and to a lesser extent Australia, autonomy has been eroded with an ever-growing list of KPIs dictated by whatever are the institution's current strategic priorities. That is the case. I mean, if you've been paying attention to what's going on in academia and other places, you don't have the freedom of maneuver, you might say, right? Isabel says, maybe where you are, there is a work-life balance. Your choice of research does not depend on what is fashionable. You can focus on teaching if you want. There's enough money to have fun, and bullying isn't the norm. And maybe expectations are achievable. Lucky you. Simon says, in many ways, the thread in the comments sum academia up. And how so? Well, you've got some very privileged people weighing in, and then you've got the rest of us, the unwashed masses saying, yeah, things aren't quite so rosy as you're saying. So in principle, it can be a fantastic career with many of the benefits you mentioned. The reality is sadly often very different. I'm very lucky where I currently work, but I've also been in some incredibly toxic environments. In those workplaces, I saw significant workplace bullying, unrealistic work expectations, lack of work-life balance, discrimination of various forms, poor pay and benefits, pressure on what to research, lack of effective management, job insecurity, work-related health issues, etc. So, some factors that are well worth taking in. Now, here's another set of responses that focus on how much academia has actually changed. It wasn't as bad as it currently is, and a lot of people are quite out of touch. Here's a great one by Jeff Melnick. Wow, that was a long nap. Think I'll pick up my PhD diploma and go take a walk around campus here in 1961, right? There's another one. Perhaps I'm living in a parallel universe, but great work-life balance in academia, freedom, fun. This may have been true 20 years ago. I understand why people prefer industry to academia, and I would probably do the same if I could turn the clock back. Here's another one from Drew, late to this, but the idea that becoming a professor is just an option that one might choose among X others that are on the table infuriates, because that's not how the labor pool works. And it hasn't worked that way for a really, really long time. That's quite true. Back when I was a graduate student coming out of graduate school with my PhD, there was already incredible competition for the jobs that were available. Much of it was a matter of luck or prestige or having been the right person in the right place at the right time, and not a matter of merit whatsoever. And that was, now going on 20 years. Here's another one. This thread is why I struggle giving advice to students. This is a very important issue. Academia today and academia even 5 to 10 years ago are not at all the same. I've had great mentors, but I've also heard way, way too much terrible advice from senior people who don't know what the job market is like, who don't understand what current academic positions are like for people who are not tenured, advanced career professors. Here's another good follow-up, and this is a caution that we should be paying attention to. The quote tweets are making fun of how absurdly out of touch this thread is, but this is what every prospective PhD student will be getting told at their recruitment weekends. We need to change what we're telling people going into academia. We also need to change the perception that if you leave with your PhD and you're not getting a teaching position, somehow you've failed rather than the system is broken down, or that if you leave for some other job that you're, abandoning the life of the mind. And unfortunately, there's still this toxic culture going on there. Finally, here are some interesting observations. Yes, it's wonderful and unique, academia, which is why there are 10 or 100 or 1,000 candidates for every opening. It's closer to 1,000 than it is to 100. And in a competitive field, luck becomes the dominating factor in success. If you have tenure, consider yourself as having won the lottery and have some humility. That's a great bit of advice. If you're benefiting from things, then maybe don't, act as if it's a meritocracy and everybody's got an equal chance if they just apply themselves, because you're just perpetuating a lie, and a lie that's damaging to so many people. Here's another one. My feed is full of people leaving academia because academics like this rather take advantage of their privilege in hostile institutions for money, esteem, and power, rather than help those institutions become more inclusive. If you have a tenure track position, especially if you're being hired, as a chair, then you probably have some, let's call it, moral duties. There are some things incumbent upon you to better the institution and better the people who are worse off within the institution, rather than simply taking advantage of how nice it is for you and all the opportunities and prestige. But what do we see instead? Very few tenure track professors do the right thing. Here's another one. I love my job, but there's so much luck in being able to realize the things you mentioned. What you said assumes that one can get a full-time tenure track job. Many adjuncts I know don't have this experience and often aren't included by their department in events, decision-making, etc. So what does that tell us? Well, if you want to be good to the people who are doing the most work in academia, the adjuncts, maybe if you're a tenure track person, you do include them. You work to do so. Finally, here's another one along those lines. Huge percentage of faculty work in conditions that are nothing like what you describe. Serious question. Have you thought about using your prestige and status to fight for non-tenured colleagues who are crushed by 4-4 teaching loads? And those, by the way, are low. I know people who've worked 8 classes in a semester. The faculty life you describe should be universal. So this is to bring this to a close. It's not just about this one clueless, tone-deaf professor who is crowing about how wonderful it is for her. And, there are, to be fair, there were some other people chiming in saying, yes, I totally agree with you. Academia is so amazing. And then other people, of course, responded to them in these ways. We should think about how the system ought to be changed and who ought to be doing the work to change it. You can say, unionize or something like that. But really, who is at the core of how this ought to change? It is the people who were lucky, who wound up with these tenure track jobs. They're the ones who should be doing the real work in making things better for their colleagues. So I'll just leave that there, and you can ponder this thread. You can easily find it on Twitter just by putting in some of the people's names and doing a search. And hopefully this has given you some food for thought.